uh, our, I think, sixth webinar in our interdivisional webinar series on climate justice. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Brittany Bloodhart, who's here representing APA Division 9 species, and she'll be talking about addressing environmental justice through a gendered lens. We're a few minutes late, and I apologize for the delay, so I'm going to let her take it away. I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video so I don't distract you.
Okay, so thank you. I recognize a few names of people attending. So for those of you who I don't know, I'm Brittany Bloodhart. I'm an associate professor of psychology at California State University, San Bernardino. And I was sort of told I could talk about whatever I wanted today. So I've been working for the past several months now on a chapter looking at the intersection of gender and climate change. And so I figured I would kind of give a general overview for those who are not highly involved in that area of research, how gender and the environment intersect. Especially related to environmental justice and social justice. And then figured I would sprinkle in some of my own research in various places where it kind of fits in here. So generally, I'm going to talk about harms from environmental issues and climate change, who is concerned in taking action and who is not. What are the solutions and how does gender influence the way people think about solutions? And then a little bit about uh, the small amount of research we have on other diversity of gendered perspectives. So one of the biggest findings in terms of environment and gender is that women are disproportionately harmed by environmental issues, including climate change, compared to men, globally, as well as, within a lot of countries that we would associate with having more gender rights. This is largely because women are much more likely to be in poverty or experiencing other kinds of socioeconomic issues. Women around the world are also much more likely to be dependent on natural resources. So there's a lot of places in the world where women have to walk every day to access clean water. And climate change, for example, is impacting the distance that they're having to walk to access those resources, as well as harsh conditions under which they're having to do that. Women also engage in more care and repair kinds of work when there are environmental issues or natural disasters. Another example is that when there are limited number of resources, such as a lack of food, there are places in the world where women are devalued compared to men and will eat last. And so if there's a lack of food, we see malnourishment in women and female children. By the way, I've noticed there's some chat questions and I can't see them, so I'm just going to assume that that I can answer those at the end if that's okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Please continue. Yeah.
Okay. Women are also the ones who are disproportionately responsible for caregiving in almost every country of the world. Even when they're employed outside the home, women are still much more likely to be expected to take on caregiving roles. And so we know that environmental impacts impact women more than men because they are often taking care of others who are also experiencing health or economic harms due to environmental problems. As I mentioned, climate change and environmental natural disasters hurts people's health, and women in particular tend to be more impacted in some ways in terms of health. This can include, being pregnant, giving birth, but also differences in biological ability to regulate temperature, um, as well as it includes the way that women are exposed to different environmental hazards in their social spaces. So, in a lot of impoverished parts of the world, people use biomass fuels for cooking, which can have significant health impacts. And women, as you likely know, are overwhelmingly responsible for cooking. Another example that's always really stuck with me was the 2004 tsunami that happened in Southeast Asia. Uh, there was a lot of information out there about what happened with the tsunami and the toll that it took. But what people often don't hear about is that it's estimated that around 80% more women were killed during the tsunami compared to men or children. And they think that there's a variety of sociocultural reasons for that. One is that women were more likely to put the safety of their children first. Another is that in predominantly Muslim societies, women were less comfortable with leaving their homes. If being uncertain about what was coming, it was more safe to stay in the home than risk being out in public alone. And women were much less likely than men to have been taught how to swim. Uh, Generally because it was assumed it's not as important for women, and women and men are not often allowed to be in the same bodies of water, like a swimming pool. Men do experience impacts from climate change as well. So, men are more likely than women to serve in physically demanding and outdoors types of jobs. They're also more likely to work in risky jobs and to um, engage in helping behaviors when climate emergencies happen. So we see some mental health impacts for men due to climate change and other environmental impacts. Men are more likely to have a higher risk of suicide related to climate change, both from extreme temperatures, which increases aggression, and also men's choice of method for committing suicide. Also, I don't have this in my notes, but I would say we know there's also gender differences in people's willingness to access mental health resources. Finally, climate change is disproportionately impacting women through climate migration. So, an estimated 80% of people who are migrating due to climate change are actually women. Um, a big driver in whether people can migrate successfully has to do with their ability to access economic resources, especially if women are not part of a male-dominated family. It's difficult for them to make an income on their own, to be able to get loans or that kind of thing. Also, women and girls are more likely to experience physical and sexual violence when they're living in unstable places or non-permanent places due to a lack of resources and social protections. And then again, women are often restricted from owning land. They can be restricted from renting certain living spaces if they don't have a male representative, like a husband or father. Um, so migrating also is difficult for that reason. And even in places where women are not technically banned from accessing these things, we still see bias in terms of women's ability to access better paying jobs and loans and things like that. Education is another really important area in terms of helping people adapt to environmental harms, not only in terms of awareness about what's going on and knowledge about how to adapt, but also accessing better job opportunities and economic resources. So there's plenty of places in the world where women's value or girls' value is their education is undervalued. Excuse me, that's what I meant to say. Uh, but even in the US and other highly developed countries, we still see differences, especially in terms of higher paying fields. Science and engineering are still much more likely to be held by men than they are women. So this is a bit of a tangent, but a related study that I've done. I've done a fair amount of work in terms of women in STEM, and women in geosciences in particular. This study, we looked at undergraduate women taking science courses at a typical university here in the US. Um, we looked at both life and physical science courses, and we got a roster of, I think we had, gosh, 9, 10, 11, something like 11 courses from the two different areas of life science and physical science. Life science tends to have more women currently graduating, things like biology, ecology, whereas physical science is still much more heavily male dominated. So those were courses like math and physics and engineering. And so we got a roster of all the students in the classes, and we asked students, which people in your class would you prefer to study with, ask for help? Who do you find the most knowledgeable in your class, and who do you think are best in the class? Um, so a lot of data on the screen, but essentially what we find is that um, women are more likely to select other women. So the dependent variable here is the proportion of women in the class who are selected for each of these four things. Do they study with? Who do they ask for help? Um, and a couple of metrics to look at here. First of all, the black bar represents 50-50, equal proportion of men and women chosen, right? So if it was simply equal or there was no influence of gender on whether people would pick who they wanted to study with, who they thought was the best in the class, we would see these numbers hovering around 50%. We do see that more women are picking, or that female students, women students, are picking other women in their life science courses as those they think are doing well. But this number drops below 50% in the physical science courses. And then again, you can see the difference there between uh, women students and men students and who they choose, right? So men are less likely to choose other women in their classes as being knowledgeable or the best in the class. If a 50-50 metric isn't quite fair, we also looked at the actual proportion of women to men in these courses. So as I said, there are more women in the life science courses than men, and there are more men than women in physical science courses. And this was our proportion in these actual courses. So when we look at this, we find that there's actually an even bigger difference in terms, especially of men and who they're selecting as the best in the class. They're less likely to select women in both life and physical science courses. And then we also looked at women, the proportion of women who were in the top 10%, and we see a similar pattern here. And finally, we were able to obtain grades for all of these classes. So at the end of the semester, we were able to actually look at who was doing well in the courses. And we found these are z-scores because averages differed across the different courses. But we found that women were outperforming men in both life science courses and in physical science courses. So even though there are fewer women and women are assumed to be doing much less well than men in physical science courses, they are still outperforming men in these courses. So we're still seeing a bias toward women even when they're doing well. Another aspect of gender in the environment that I wanted to talk about was the socialization of gender and how that interacts with our views about gender and the environment. So first of all, there's a very common finding in environmental psychology that women are more likely to be concerned about the environment and climate change, and they're much more likely than men to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. This is a very consistent finding across a lot of research. And it's somewhat easy to essentialize this information. We have a sort of social tendency or I guess, yeah, the way that we tend to think about, right, Mother Earth, or the divine feminine, or women's natural connection to the earth and the environment. Um, we tend to assume that women just naturally nurture and put others' needs before their own. And that includes taking care of the planet or animals. Um, but as I said, this tends to sort of biologically essentialize women's concern and women's interaction with the environment. Similarly, we have a lot of stereotypes about, uh, women are materialistic. Um, so, for example, we often blame women for higher consumption, even though we know that women consume less than men. So women are stereotyped as shopping more. However, women are more likely to be purchasing goods and essential needs for everyone in the household as opposed to just themselves. Whereas men's consumption tends to be more specific to them individually and also tends to have a greater impact overall, even though it may not look like purchasing individual items. So we see far greater consumption by men. So some of what's interesting about that is research that's looked at the way that pro-environmental behavior is influenced by perceptions about masculinity and endorsement of traditional masculinity, endorsement of gender roles. So these are tend to be agreed upon pillars of traditional masculinity. Um, and in particular, we see related to that in terms of pro-environmental behaviors, um, men are less likely to engage in behaviors that they see as feminine. So these can include caretaking roles, right? We talked about earlier women's caretaking roles related to the environment. Research also finds that men and women's endorsement of these traditionally masculine norms um, influences their willingness to support pro-environmental policies. Another area is status seeking. So we see that men tend to avoid behaviors that signal any kind of a reduction in status as well as femininity. Those two things, unsurprisingly, go hand in hand as well. So um, men are less likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors that essentially make them look poor or look like they have less status, taking the bus, for example. However, research finds that if you frame pro-environmental behaviors as reaffirming men's status or masculine identity, then they are more likely to make a pro-environmental choice. And so we've seen this, with perhaps the new flashy and electric cars and things like that. Men are making choices to engage in these pro-environmental behaviors if they promote status. So essentially, even though we see a lot of gender differences in pro-environmental behavior and pro-environmental concern, a lot of that tends to actually be explained by other factors that once you account for people's socioeconomic status, their political orientation, their religious beliefs and values, we tend to see that gender differences in concern and behavior largely disappear. So um, essentially the point I'm trying to make is that um sorry, I just just was thinking about you all are online and I can't see any of you. Um that gender differences are not due to biologically derived differences. They are due to socialized practices and beliefs about who does what and who's allowed to do what and express what. Um, Related to that, ecofeminism is a theory that I use quite a bit in my work. It mostly comes from philosophy, geography, other kind of social sciences and philosophical disciplines. But it asserts essentially that social systems create and support a hierarchical sort of belief value structure that emphasizes the importance of some human groups over other human groups, such as men over women, whites over other racial groups. Um, and also encourages sort of domination of humans over the natural world, over animals, plants, the ability to protect natural resources. So, the first paper that I ever published, first author paper, was sort of explore this from an empirical or psychological standpoint. So we ended up taking data from a variety of countries. So this is country level data, and looking at this idea of hegemonic or dominance values. And we used both hierarchical values for people. So these are Schwartz's moral values, hierarchy versus egalitarianism, which talks about the way people prioritize people over other people, as well as mastery versus harmony with the environment. So prioritizing humans over the natural world. We got data from 60 different countries, and so these are sort of color coded by those that had the strongest hegemonic values, 2 standard deviations above the mean, down to the weakest or least hegemonic values, which were 2 standard deviations below the mean. You can see that the US is on the higher end there. So what we found was that as ecofeminism proposes, these different types of hegemonic values, values about dominance of people and dominance over the environment, were highly related to each other at 0.88. We also found that together these values predicted country level exploitation of women. So these were measures of women's rights within various countries and exploitation of the environment. So we looked at environmental policies, environmental harm, et cetera. Which also makes sense that those two outcomes were also related to each other, but much more weakly than the two hegemonic values. Something else that I think a lot about, especially when we're thinking about dominance and who deserves what and who is better than whom. We tend to make a lot of social comparisons. I'm a social psychologist. I know a lot of those of you on here are as well. And so, how do we think about what I deserve, what other people deserve to have, um, and comparing myself to other people? I think um, can go into a lot of intergroup relation kind of work, social justice work that comes out of social psychology and other areas. We have different rules and different expectations for essentially people who are in our in group and people who are in our out groups. Um, so one thing that I've considered quite a bit is people's thinking about when they are deprived. So if you listen to people talk about their support for social issues, for environmental issues, something that tends to come up a lot when they're talking about um, resisting those issues or resisting policies to address those issues is feeling like they're going to be deprived of something. Um, but an interesting question is to think about who we are deprived compared to. Um, so what do I deserve? Well, it depends on what other people have in order for me to make that evaluation of what I think I deserve, right? So this might be a lovely house to live in. It may be kind of similar to most of the houses that we live in, those of you who are on the call here. But I might feel particularly deprived. I might feel like I deserve more if I'm comparing myself to people who live something like this, right? I might think that I need to move up in the hierarchy. I need um, to value status seeking and things like that. However, if I'm comparing myself to someone who lives in a shelter like this, I might be a lot less likely to think that I deserve the mansion, that I deserve more, and maybe I'm more willing to sort of live the way I live or give up a few things that I have if I'm comparing myself, if I'm thinking about the deservingness of people who are living in the picture on the left. So I've done a number of studies looking at this idea of feeling deprived. There's a lot of data on this page, but really all that I'm trying to point out here is that when we ask people about their support for social issues, such as their support for climate change policies, um, we ask them, how deprived would you feel if there was a policy to address, something like climate change? How do you feel about universal health care, et cetera? And then we ask them a variety of actions. Would you be willing to engage in these different actions in order to address these issues? And across the board, we see really strong negative correlations between the amount that people feel that they would be deprived from that social issue and their willingness to engage in behaviors that would ameliorate that social issue, which makes sense. Um, So, how can we change the way that people are thinking about their in-groups and out-groups? How can we change who they compare themselves to in order to feel more or less deprived? Um, well, it turns out social psychology has a pretty strong history of looking at how to change people's group identity or get them to think differently about other people, whether they are considered in-group or out-group members. And so a couple of techniques developed by various psychologists include thinking about similarity between ourselves and others. What do we have in common? Thinking about cooperation. How do we have to work together in order to both achieve a common goal? And then sharing a common goal, right? We all want certain basic things out of life. We all value certain things. And that really helps us to see others as similar to us, as deserving of the same things as us. So in another study that we conducted, or I conducted, I guess, um, we looked at whether we could inform people about those who are much more deprived than we are. So they read information either about people in the global south, people living in Africa, women specifically, or animals who are all harmed by climate change. So first they read about the harms that these different potential outgroups are experiencing. And then we had them engage in some of those tasks that I mentioned over here. So they did different things in order to they had to write about how similar they were to a person depicted in this information, how they could cooperate on a mutual task, and some of the shared goals and values that they had. And what I found was that um, when we did not do those relativity exercises, or we did not do those exercises which were meant to increase the perception that these distant others, these deprived others, are part of our in-group. In other words, they're not relative to us necessarily. It didn't matter if people received information about climate change harms toward those groups or not. We basically saw about the same amount of willingness to engage in pro-environmental behaviors, regardless of whether they saw or they heard about the climate change harms. However, when they engaged in those relativity exercises, so they both read about harms happening to women as a result of climate change, and they had to think about why women's experiences, and this one women we described in particular, was relative to them, had similar goals and life views and things like that to them, they were more likely to engage in those pro-environmental behaviors, or willing to engage in them. We also saw that this effect was even stronger for conservatives compared to liberals. Again, liberals already started out being more willing to engage in pro-environmental behaviors, but we saw that this especially the activity of getting people to think about others who are harmed, who have less than us, being part of our in-group, being relative to us, um, had a more dramatic shift in willingness for conservatives. All right. The last area I want to talk about are solutions to environmental issues and to climate change. Again, this is another area where gender impacts the way that people think about solutions, who's creating those solutions. So this is a picture of the leaders, or at least kind of the major leaders at COP29. Um, Essentially, women are less likely to benefit from solutions to environmental issues because they are not the ones making those decisions. Men are 3 times more likely than women to serve as representatives in government across the globe. Um, and within discussions about climate change solutions, they are usually led by men. And even though the UN's sustainability goals includes gender and gender justice, a lot of discussions still happen with while ignoring kind of gender-related issues and perceptions about what are acceptable solutions. Um, a lot of adaptation or mitigation strategies to climate change tend to focus on individual home-based changes in behaviors. So, for example, not using your washing machine or dishwasher, but instead doing those chores by hand, reducing car idling. These are all behaviors that women engage in more than men, and are all restrictions that make things more challenging for women. It take up more time, increase domestic duties. Um, Similarly, other solutions such as taking public transit tends to be more difficult for people who are engaging in caregiving roles and responsibilities, which, as I mentioned before, also tend to be women, right? So the idea of taking the bus or taking public transit is certainly harder when you are caring for an elderly relative or a child. Uh, the impacts of climate change are often invisible. So, as I started with all of that information about the harms toward women from environmental issues, I don't know how many of you were surprised by some of those statistics, but we tend to not hear about the specific gendered impacts of environmental issues. So most of the time when people are communicating about climate change and other natural disasters, they focus on animals. Um, or to a lesser extent, African and Southeastern Pacific coastal populations tend to be depicted as kind of the prototypical victims of climate change or of extreme weather. When women, oh, when women are depicted, this was just a really quick Google image search. I typed in women climate change, and this was the vast majority of images that came up here. And that fits with the research, which says that when women are depicted, it is as helpless victims, most often as women of color, and most often in the global south or developing countries. And that can be an issue because it removes agency and reinforces the narrative that um, white people, that men need to make decisions and help those affected by climate change, women and children, and takes away um, or it hides women's actual perspectives on what is most helpful in terms of making climate change solutions, um, and ways that those solutions may impact them. However, women are pushing back around the world that they're victims of climate change. Yes, women are disproportionately more harmed, but they are also disproportionately more likely to stand up and be climate leaders, engaging in policy and protests. When it comes to people's preferences for individual behaviors, people tend to generally, and both men and women tend to prefer low cost sort of solutions, right? Recycling is an easy thing. It makes me feel good. I did my part to help the environment. Um, and it helps people to avoid um, behavioral interventions that make a bigger impact on their lives. We don't really want to go out of our way to reduce our energy consumption if it becomes inconvenient, right? Um, this is, again, as I talked about before, um, paralleled by findings that men are more willing to engage in behaviors that are consistent with masculine or male roles. Right? So something like installing energy efficient household intervention, yeah, insulation or solar panels, things like that. And men tend to avoid, again, things that tend to be associated with femininity, such as not eating meat. At a larger scale, men are more likely to prefer external, technology-based policies and solutions to environmental issues, whereas women are more likely to support individual behavior and lifestyle changes. Um, when women are not included in policies that are meant to address environmental issues, they are often the impact of those potential solutions is overlooked. So people create a policy to change farming practices, but they don't consider how the gendered implications of how that might increase women's work or impact their livelihoods in other ways, as well as our reliance on technology and coming up with green uh, technological solutions. Solar panels and electric cars both require um, cobalt and other extraction of resources, which then creates more e-waste, and women and children are disproportionately more likely to be the ones um, who uh, who deal with that in terms of labor, cleanup, um, and where that stuff is disposed of. However, research finds that when solutions to environmental issues include women's perspectives, they are more successful. So that includes women and indigenous knowledges. This is an image of Tay women from northern Vietnam. And I just include this example. It was these women were successful in petitioning the government to consider their local knowledge about watersheds um, and uh, and where critical watersheds lie in order to protect certain resources, so that when the government was making policies about protecting certain areas of land, that this really influenced agricultural outcomes for women. To the degree that men endorse hegemonic values more than women, we also see that, again, they prioritize economic prosperity when they're talking about environmental solutions, right? So, why should we help the environment? Well, it's going to ultimately benefit us economically. But again, it's not gender per se that's leading to these differences in preference. So we also find that conservative women, rich women, who tend to also value traditional hegemonic values and systems, are more likely to propose the same sort of solutions or lack thereof as men. I'm going to skip through a couple of areas here just because I think I'm a little bit low on time, but this is essentially talking about how we communicate about climate change. And men tend to avoid feminine emotions related to climate change. So this is a study we did looking at uh, people expressing things like sadness and fear, which are considered feminine emotions. Men are less likely to express those, whereas men and women are similarly likely to express anger, which is considered a more masculine emotion. We also looked at whether people thought that those expressing emotions were more likely to be men or women. So we gave them some text that expressed sadness or fear or anger compared to no emotion. And all that this graph is really showing here, this 0 point is how likely they said it was neither a man nor a woman. Everything above the line there is most likely a woman. So, especially for sadness, people assume that anytime sadness is expressed, it's more likely to be women doing that compared to men. Whereas fear tended to be a little bit above, but wasn't significantly different from zero there, as well as anger and no emotion. Including women and gender minority individuals in leadership on environmental problems and climate change is very important. We know that countries that have more women in government are more likely to pass laws and policies to address climate change. And women directors of companies are more likely to incorporate uh, environmental sustainability into their businesses. In terms of the scientific solutions toward climate change and the environment, um, this is just data from the US, but globally, white men are much, much more likely to be scientists and engineers working on these issues. Um, and because people's perspectives often influence the questions that they ask, the methods that they use to try to understand these issues, this can be a problem. We know that diverse teams in science create more innovative and effective solutions. And again, this is because people are coming from different perspectives. They're asking different types of questions. They have different concerns. They're thinking about different outcomes and impacts. So, similar to this, we were interested in whether taking others' perspectives can influence people's willingness to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. There's a number of research studies that have looked at this. We looked at it actually in terms of animals. So can taking an animal's perspective influence people's willingness to help? We I guess I should put this here first. So we gave them two different, either information about a koala named Sam who was harmed from climate change, who burned her little paws trying to walk through the burning forest, or polar bears and melting ice. We gave them information about how climate change is harming both of these animals. And we gave them instructions either to feel empathic, imagine how the animal feels and what's happened to it, to remain objective and detached, or we gave them no instructions at all. And we paid them to do the study, but in addition to that, we gave them an extra dollar, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we're psychologists, so we don't have a lot of money to give out here. We told them that they could donate that dollar, and we gave them a variety of environmental groups that they could potentially donate that to. They could keep it for themselves or they could give it back to us. Nobody was really interested in giving it back to us. So we ended up looking at how much money they kept for themselves versus how much they decided to donate to the environmental group. And what we found was when we gave them no instructions about how to feel about the message, they kept about 2/3 of the dollar for themselves and donated about 1/3. Similar pattern for the objective condition, remain objective and detached. Think about the grammar of the writing, things like that. But what we saw was the flip effect when we asked them to empathize. So take the other perspective. People were more likely to donate money to the environmental group than to keep more money for themselves. Okay, I'm going to skip through a number of things here just because I'm looking at the time. Um, Yeah, I'll skip through some of this. This is a study where we're trying to look at moral emotions and values related to policy support for ethical consumption, and we're finding gender differences, and we're still sort of trying to figure out why. So anyway, this is a lot of slides, and I'm going to flip through them really quickly. I'm happy to stay on and chat more about it if people are interested. And just the last thing I want to touch on here is the fact that um, there is a lot of gender and sexual diversity that is not represented in the research that I've been talking about. So the majority of research in environmental psychology, as well as in other areas, primarily describes the perspectives of white, heterosexual, cisgender women or men. However, there's a growing but small body of research looking at queer and non-binary perspectives on the environment. Um, we know that this is a great large kind of overview, comprehensive study that was done um, that actually LGBTQ people are even more likely to say they believe in climate change and be concerned about climate change compared to cisgender heterosexual people, which is the darker blue bar there on the right. And gender minority people are also more likely to experience even more negative impacts from environmental issues like climate change, mostly related to the fact that they are even further marginalized in society. LGBT individuals, especially youth, are more likely to be poor, unhoused, or struggling with food insecurity or mental illnesses. They are often excluded even from debates about gender because they don't fit neatly into this category of women and women's experiences. So, in summary, uh, the gendered aspects of environmental justice are related to the impacts that people experience, the social systems, the way that we think about um, who is important and who is not, what we value and what we don't, the solutions, as well as differences in gender diversity. Okay, sorry to rush through at the end, but I can stop here and actually look at questions.
Great. Thank you so much. There's a few questions in the Q&A tab to begin with.
Okay.
I don't know if you can open it on your end.
Yes, I can. Okay. Um, let's see. So looks like that's not a question.
The first one is by Luca.
Luca. I don't. Okay,
I
I'm
can just,
just looking at the chat, and maybe am I supposed to be looking at something
I
else?
just texted it to you in the chat. It says, are all the analysis based on, uh,
Yeah,
oh, Luca says you already answered his question.
yeah. So primarily, most of this research is uh, done on gender as a binary. Um, as I said, yeah, toward the end, there's a small but growing amount of research that's trying to rectify that. But yes.
And then this is the second question posted in the chat. I sent it to you as a private message so that you.
Okay, so I'll read the question. The point about the association between gender differences and pro-environmental behaviors being mediated by other social factors was well made. However, similarly, wouldn't we also expect biologically mediated differences to be unfolding too? Um, such as brain autonomy, physiology, neurochemistry. Um, that's an interesting question. So I would argue, well, first of all, I didn't make this point, but I would argue that sex as well as gender is socially constructed. So people are not binary in terms of male and female, either brains, physiology, hormones. Um, so so it's hard to argue that there are gross biological differences that are influencing how people um, I mean, as I said before, some of the health impacts, for example, like for people who are pregnant or give birth or who are nursing, right? There's a biological difference there. Not all females engage in those things or have the ability to do these things. So, similarly, some of the research on um, like the way that heat impacts males and females, it's another study that looked just grossly at sex assigned at birth. So it was a binary category. And they're making the case that based on hormones and temperature regulation, that females have a harder time with heat exposure. But again, there's such a variety of there's there heterogeneity of people's hormones, right? Even within the category of female or male, that it's sort of hard to really make that claim. It would be better if we were talking about, people who have certain hormone levels have a harder time adapting to heat exposure than females or males. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
And then there's also a question. So Divine Teocum wants to connect with you. So um, if you want, you can put your email in the chat and they can reach out if you're
Yeah, can you
interested.
also see my screen? My email's there, but I'll put it in the chat
Oh
as
yeah. So yeah, Divine, please feel free to email, and they put their email in there as well. And then Janet had a question as well.
okay.
Um,
I don't see it. Is it? Yeah,
oh, I'll read it out.
I-
Let's. Um, it says, "Great to hear your talk and how you pulled it all together. I look forward to seeing your chapter. Concerning the relative comparisons, do you think people will differ in their desire and tendency to seek out relative comparisons, and are these tendencies gendered?"
Mm, yeah, that's a good question. I have not looked into people's willingness to seek out those kind of relative comparisons. I would say that um, so one factor that I think is related to already seeing people as more relative is like I look a lot at the Schwartz values of self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. And so self-transcendence is a value that talks about caring for others, being concerned about harms towards others, more than just the things that are affecting myself. And we know that women tend to be higher in self-transcendence than men. So I would assume that there would be gender differences in people's willingness to seek that out. Um, but I haven't looked at that specifically.
And then I have one final question myself. I was wondering, given how widespread pluralistic ignorance is on climate change, so people just are terrible at estimating what's the most common public opinion, and we tend to especially underestimate how well supported climate action initiatives or policies are, or how concerned people are. I wonder, do you think people will underestimate one, impacts by climate change, the disproportionate impacts on specific populations? And then if that is true, how can we best correct that misperception? And as a side note, I guess that was 1A, 1B, and 1C is, are the people who are disproportionately impacted aware they are disproportionately impacted? Um, those are
Um,
those are interconnected questions. Feel free to answer any of them.
so let's see. Going back to your question about uh, sort of ignorance about who is impacted. I mean, I think, yeah, the research definitely supports that in general, we just are not aware of how harmed people are, especially those of us, sitting comfortably in our houses in here in the US and in other kind of globally northern countries. Um, and I think part of that is, people uh, don't want to be burdened with that information. It's overwhelming. There's lots of studies out there talking about the concern about overwhelming people, right? Climate burnout and things like that. Um, so yeah, I don't necessarily know the answer to that. I mean, I do think especially having women and racially marginalized and indigenous peoples at these like climate talks and things like that is really important. Having a lot of them there, right? Not just having the token person representing something, but actually showing that there are a lot of people who have different perspectives and experiences related to these issues. Is that
Yeah.
It answers part of your question. I don't remember if I got the whole thing.
No, that's fine. And we are running out of time. There is one final question by Stephanie
Oh, I
Lamb
do see that
in
one. Let's see.
the
Um,
chat. It's near the end. I can read it out loud if you want, but
yeah, so in terms of gender and climate change, climate impacts, what are the needs, desires, and gaps that are important to explore and continue research on? What has not been ventured that is important to consider and actively investigate for solution making? Uh, um, other than the gaps that I mentioned, um, I mean, I guess I'm kind of going back to things I said before in terms of having more women and diversity in terms of people who are thinking about solutions and making decisions based on solutions, um, or solution-based decisions. Um, I also think, right, we tend to do this across the board in psychology and everywhere else. But white, cisgender, heterosexual women do not represent all women in the world, and that's really important to think about. Um, but that's the majority of whose voice gets represented when we do talk about gender. Um, let's see. I don't know. There's a number of areas. I don't know if I can name uh, specific ones that are most important to consider. Um, those are the two that come to mind, I guess.
well, thank you. And with that, I think we're at time. I want to take another second to thank Brittany. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. The recording will be posted online for those who attended, and we had another 180 attendees who signed up that are across the world that were not able to make it as well. So just keep an eye out, and then I will send an email to everyone with information on the next webinar for October. Right. Enjoy the rest of your days, everyone. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you for inviting me.